introduce myself. My name is Prince Will, and I'm going to be your moderator today for this meeting, dealing on the topic land degradation, forest community adaptation strategies. If I'm to simply put it, I would say that land degradation can be seen as a decline or deterioration in the productivity or quality of land, usually as a result of human activities or because of some natural factors. Even it's quite alarming that WHO said that up to 40% of the land on Earth currently is degraded. And this problem is not just peculiar to countries outside of Africa. You can see it here in Nigeria. If I'm to be more specific, I reside in Anambra State, and we've noticed that some community members migrate to other communities as a result of degradation caused by soil erosion. But without further ado, that's why we invited an expert here to take us more, to throw more light on what land degradation is all about, these causes, and possible adaptive strategies on how to provide some solutions. I would like to welcome him in our midst. He's a passionate environmentalist focused on providing solutions to issues of desertification, drought, disaster, land degradation, and pollution. He is the founder of Voice for Environment, a state rep of 111112 Foundation, a young digital activist with climate and sustainable development network, Youth Caucus Land Tenure Facilitator, NAGGWU champion, and an alumni of Cohort 3 Nairobi Summer School on Climate Justice. Please let us welcome Mr. Musa Ibrahim, our speaker for the day, to take over from here. Also, take note, any questions that may arise during the course of this series, any question that may arise can be dropped in the chat box and will be attended to during the Q&A. So let us give Mr. Musa Ibrahim a listening ear. Thank you.
Okay, good evening, good afternoon, depending from where you are joining us. Thank you very much, Prince Will, for that wonderful biography and invitation, as well as introduction. Thank you once again to Laura and every other team that has put up this July Green Convo series. As you have earlier introduced, my name is Musa Ibrahim, and first, I am an environmentalist and a grassroots champion. So the topic before me today is land degradation, forest community adaptation strategies. Please, can you go to the first slide?
Okay, we are there.
Perfect. I want our listeners to be able to follow up on what we are discussing. So I cannot make progress in this conversation without giving some conceptual clarification or understanding about some of these phrases or concepts that are embedded in this conversation. The first I would like to talk about is land degradation. As our moderator have mentioned, we are not just facing issue of land degradation across Africa, but Africa is also hugely affected by land degradation. And when we talk about land degradation, I think it implies that there is a loss or reduction of biological or economic productivity and complexity of a land. This land could be a forest area, could be a wetland, it could be a desert or dry land. So when these lands are subjected to deforestation, when they are subjected to unsustainable agricultural practices, they become prone to land degradation. In another context, when we are talking about land degradation, we can also look at it in the aspect of dry, subhumid environment, which in turn leads to desertification. So basically, land degradation is one of the most pressing issues of our time. And according to the report, second report of the UNCCD Global Land Outlook report, 40% of our ice-free land is degraded or is degrading. This is a stark reminder that without adaptation efforts, without mitigation efforts, without ensuring that all hands are on deck, we are going to continue to face tremendous impact of climate change. So the next I would like to talk about is adaptation. From the word adaptation, when we say adaptation or climate adaptation or climate change adaptation, it entails basically actions that are undertaken to prepare for or adjust to both the current and projected impacts of climate change. 2019, 2020, and other years have been a very critical year for a country like Nigeria, where we have had one of the most devastating flooding that has led to not just destruction of property, destruction of farmlands, but also loss of lives and loss of livelihood. So one of the things that we are looking at adaptation, how can we be able to adapt? How can we be able to adjust? For instance, when there is flooding, how can community become more resilient? Things like embankment, things like mangrove restoration. These are some of these pathways we can be able to adapt. Things like drought-resistant crops. These are some of the pathways we can be able to create adaptation to some of the impacts of climate change, like flooding, like drought, like heat wave, and other impact or effects of climate change. Then we go into the triple planetary crisis. The United Nations system have clearly outlined that there is a need for a robust effort to solving the issue of climate change and other poly-crises that we are facing today. So in that note, when we talk about the triple planetary crisis, we are talking about the crisis of climate change. We are talking about the crisis of nature loss, pollution. We are talking about the crisis of nature loss, biodiversity loss, or land degradation. And lastly, we are talking about pollution and waste. These three planetary crises are one of the key problems we are facing today in our world, and a lot of emphasis, a lot of effort are being placed in order not to look at them individually, but address them jointly. Then we look at land restoration. When we talk about land restoration, this is one of the things that as a young person, as a champion of the national agency, youth champion of the National Agency for the Great Green Wall, we have been pushing for this kind of action because it basically entails that you plant trees, you sustainably manage the land, you go into innovative agriculture, sustainable agricultural practice, and basically afforestation and reforestation. But because of the erratic nature of the climate today, when we are carrying out land restoration, we look beyond planting of trees, but how can we add vitality to the life and livelihood of the people where these projects are undertaken, or life or livelihood of these people who have been impacted by perhaps desertification, perhaps droughts, or even flooding. So basically, when we talk about land restoration, it's a cost-effective solution. It's a cost-effective solution to solving the multiple challenges of desertification, drought, and land degradation. Then we look into sustainable agriculture. Sustainable agriculture basically are agricultural practices that are not only good for the environment, but brings also money, brings income for farmers, and ensures sustainability. Example of sustainable agricultural practices that we are going to be looking at today could be agroforestry, crop rotation, and drip irrigation system that is well managed. Then we have forestry. When we say forestry, we are looking at a science that involves the maintenance and conservation of our forests. Without forestry services today, we will continue to lose a large chunk of our forest reserve. And we all know that our forests are nicknamed as the lungs of our planet. Please, next slide. Next slide, please.
Can you say it?
Okay, before that comes up, let's try as much as possible to go deeply into land degradation. So when we are talking about land degradation, we mentioned earlier
can you
that...
say it already?
Yeah, I can
Okay.
see the next slide from my own side too.
Yeah, I can also see the slide, causes of land degradation.
Piece of land, yeah.
So, yeah, perfect. Thank you very much. So let's go further to look at the causes of land degradation. What makes our soil lose nutrients? What causes erosion? What causes deforestation? What causes desertification? What causes leaching of our soil? One of these causes of land degradation today, which is very obvious to a layman, is deforestation. When we talk about deforestation, we are looking at the removal of trees for timber, agriculture, or urban development. And this indiscriminate removal of these trees or tree covers lead to severe issues like soil erosion and loss of biodiversity. Another cause of land degradation that we are going to be looking at is unsustainable agricultural practices. I mentioned earlier that more than 40% of our ice-free land today, whether in Africa or any part of the world today, is degrading or is facing degradation. One of the things that has accrued to this factor is unsustainable agricultural practices, such as monocropping, which is planting basically using one cropping system, overuse and misuse of chemical fertilizers. It's a sad scenario today that most farmers, local farmers, depend hugely on use of harmful chemicals or harmful fertilizers to be able to grow their crops. On the other hand, these have a lot of health problems that are associated with these factors. But beyond those health problems is the impact it has on our soil and on our land. We also have poor irrigation techniques that degrade soil quality and reduces its fertility. Then we have climate change. Changes in temperature and precipitation patterns lead to droughts, flood, and other extreme weather events that degrades our land. In the case of the flooding that happened in 2012, it was very obvious that many farmers lost their arable lands and they also lost their farm products. But beyond that, most of these areas that were washed off must have lost their nutrients, most of these land areas. Beyond losing their nutrients, they must have been exposed to various factors that has ensured that the biodiversity, the key pollinators like our bees, like even birds, and even other microfaunas cannot be found on those places again. This in turn reduces the productivity and the complexity of the soil that ensures agriculture practices. Then we also have overgrazing. If you go to the northern part of Nigeria today or in the Sahel region, one of the major activities or one of the major sources of livelihood is nomadic farming or herding, whereby most people or most families rear cattle, rear goats, and other livestock. When these livestock are exposed to indiscriminate feeding pattern, it thereby leaves the soil to be exposed. And bear in mind that these regions where these kind of practices are ongoing, there is low rainfall, there is high temperature. Once this factor come together, it affects the land. And this is where you now start seeing the resurgence of sand dune expansion. You are now seeing severe cases of desertification. You are seeing very high temperature because the microclimate has been impacted or affected. Then we have urbanization. I think that urbanization has also contributed immensely to the degradation of land that we are experiencing today. If you look at the latest report of the Global Land Outlook reports, land means a lot to many individuals or many stakeholders. As a farmer, land means food. As an environmentalist, land means ecosystem services. As an estate manager, land means building, because that is where they build their homes for to sell. So there is a need for us to live in harmony with nature, irrespective of the fact that we want to urbanize or go into mass housing, or we want to get materials from our forest or from our natural capital to build our homes and infrastructure. There's a need to consider, because consistent taking out of our forest without putting it back can render the forest to be degraded. And when the forest is degraded, that ecosystem services that it provides is either not sufficient or is absent. Next slide, we are going to be talking about impact of land degradation. Next slide, please. One of the very first impacts that I can be able to highlight now about the impact of land degradation is loss of biodiversity. Degraded lands, next slide please, degraded lands cannot support diverse plant and animal life, leading to a decline in species richness and species diversity, as well as ecosystem diversity. Loss of biodiversity has seriously been accrued to land degradation, because this biodiversity are not just trees that we are seeing or shrub or grasses. They can also come in the form of microorganisms. They can come in the form of pollinators. And you agree with me that without some of these our pollinators, like our birds, our bees, our butterfly, our food sufficiency will be put at risk. So one of the very first things that we need to look at when we are looking at land degradation is how it leads to loss of biodiversity. Another impact of land degradation is soil erosion, which is the removal of topsoil. It could be by wind, by water, and even humans reduce the land fertility and its ability to support agriculture through deforestation and other practices. Coincidentally, today is the first ever commemoration of the World Day to combat sand and dust storm. When there is sand and dust storm, the topsoil is either moved away or is covered. Once this form of land degradation occurs, there is loss of biodiversity, there is loss of productivity of the land, there's loss of economic productivity of that land. There's also loss of complexity of that land, because you find that the biodiversity, the microorganisms are virtually absent or minimally absent in that case. Then we also have water scarcity. When we have desertification, this is a form of land degradation in dry, subhumid environments. So when there is desertification, it affects our natural water cycle, thereby reducing water availability for both agriculture and domestic use. You agree with me that there's been a lot of alarm that our Sahel region is advancing southward. We now have states like Niger State, which was not initially a frontline state affected by desertification, now having advances of desert in Niger State. This is an indication that land degradation is setting in, and it's going to bring water scarcity to some of those areas because there's reduced rainfall and there's high evapotranspiration. Then we also have reduced agricultural productivity. When a land is facing erosion, when a land is faced with desertification, when a land is faced with leaching, and when a land is faced with dryness, what do you expect? The soil becomes degraded. There will be less yield. It impacts food security. It impacts the livelihood of people that are there. Just let's take a good instance of the Lake Chad region. Originally, the Lake Chad itself has shrunk to 10 times its original size. We already have 10% of original Lake Chad we know remaining today. This has impacted on the livelihood of the people who depend on this river for their livelihood, for fishing, for farming, for irrigation, for transportation. It has also impacted their agricultural productivity. This is why we are seeing cases of emerging conflict in some of these areas. This is why we are seeing forced migration from these places. Then socioeconomic impact of land degradation. Communities dependent on natural resources like water face economic hardship, migration, and increased vulnerability to poverty and even conflict. Just as I mentioned earlier, the Lake Chad is a very good example. It has shrunk to almost 9 to 10 times its original size, which is pretty alarming and a stark reminder that governments and other stakeholders must work day in, day out to be able to address this issue, which has compounded conflicts, migration, forced migration, and vulnerability and exposure to various unfavorable conditions. My next slide is going to be looking at forest community. Next slide, please. Forest community adaptation strategies. When I started this conversation, we tried to look what is adaptation, which basically I mentioned, it entails taking actions to prepare for and adjust to both the current and projected impacts of climate change. Adaptation strategies, which are approach that community develop and implement to cope with and mitigate adverse effects of land degradation, because effective and well-planned adaptation strategies help forest communities sustain their livelihood, protect their environment, and enhance their resilience to environmental changes. So what are some of those strategies? Next slides, please. What are some of those strategies communities, local people, farmers, environmentalists, and even governments can be able to adopt to improve not only the resilience, but be able to bring about proper adaptation for communities who are facing the brunt of climate change impact, like flooding, heat wave, desertification, droughts, and other forms of extreme weather events. So one of these pathways or one of these strategies that can be able to help community to adjust to a changing climate is agroforestry. So when we talk about agroforestry, it implies mixing various types of crops, flora, faunas in order to increase agricultural yields and sustainability. If you look at the activities of CFOR, Center for Forestry Research, and ICRAF World Agroforestry, there is a lot of emphasis on agroforestry. Agroforestry is one of the best practices that we can use to upscale food security, and we can also be able to use to improve or consolidate on our already existing ambition of sustainability or sustainable development. Agroforestry has been practiced by many local people, many indigenous people in the past, but because the concept is just becoming very pronounced now, many people are getting to know that those practices that they have been doing in the past are forms of agroforestry. So essentially, agroforestry has huge benefits. It also is a win-win. It's a win-win for the environment, it's a win-win for sustainability, and it's a win-win for our food system transformation. So it is essential that communities, local farmers begin to adopt agroforestry practice, whereby it can also be called an integrated farming system, whereby you plant crops on that piece of land, you rear your livestock, and you can also plant trees at interval. It could be linear, it could be horizontal, whatever form you like, in order to be able to have a win-win situation in such a way that if you are rearing livestock, the byproduct of those livestock are their dungs. You can use it as an organic fertilizer. From the residue from the crops, let's say, for instance, your maize or your beans, you can
Ibrahim,
also be able to.
can you hear me? Sorry to interrupt. It's just
I can hear you clearly.
we are working with time, and this meeting is going to end in the next 9 minutes.
Oh.
So if you could please round up so that we can take some questions before the meeting ends.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Perfect. Thank you very much. Okay, thank you. That is well noted. So agroforestry is a good pathway for us to be able to increase our adaptation potential towards the impact of climate change. Then we have crop rotation. Crop rotation is a very viable pathway for us to be able to increase our adaptation strategy, because when you plant on this piece of land today, this year, the crop rotation and shifting cultivation, this is what I mean. When you do crop rotation, you reduce the tendency of pest infestation. You also increase your yield by extension. Then we have community-led reforestation. They say anything for young people, anything for community, without their involvement is not for those community, or it's not for the young people. So essentially, community-led reforestation are approaches that community take are approaches that are supported by and with community for them to be able to improve the resilience of their forest through reforestation activity. Then we have land conservation. A lot of emphasis today are put on how can we conserve our lands. The land we are using today are land that we borrow from our future generation. In order to ensure that we don't consume our forest without having anything left, one of the things that is advisable and community are doing today is not just conservation of our land, but conservation of also the resources, thereby reducing poaching, illegal wildlife trade, and even deforestation activities. Then another thing that we are going to be looking at is rainwater harvesting. It's very key. Desertification is a form of land degradation. And most areas most regions that are facing desertification also face droughts, long period of no rainfall. So it is essential that as community are trying to become resilient to the impact of climate change, there is rainwater harvesting techniques or mechanism which help them to be able to adapt or adjust to the drought or the changing weather condition or climate condition of those areas. Then we have sustainable land management techniques. I mentioned crop rotation, I mentioned shifting cultivation. These are very essential. Then we have drip irrigation. In order not to waste water, in order to conserve our water resources, drip irrigation is some of the strategies that is being employed to adjust to a changing climate or extreme weather events like desertification and droughts. Then we have educational programs and workshops. It is not enough to have these technologies or this innovation. It's also important that these communities, these indigenous people, these young people are engaged continuously through educational programs and workshops so that they can be able to understand the situation better. They can be able to know more about best practices. Then we have local knowledge and participation. You have scientific knowledge, we have indigenous. We need to pair these two knowledge together so that we can be able to understand in detail some of the approaches that can be employed towards increasing climate adaptation strategies or climate adaptation initiative in some of these communities. Then we have showcasing of success stories. That is why we have summit, we have conferences, and we have meetings. It is important that in order to create an avenue for exchange, an avenue for knowledge sharing, an avenue for interaction, an avenue for display of various innovation and technology, there is a need for knowledge sharing. Because knowledge sharing helps us to understand the gaps, the challenges, and the pathway forward. So thank you very much. On this note, I say thank you all for your kind attention.
Okay. I would like to thank you very much, Mr. Musa Ibrahim, for that wonderful session just now. I know you said a lot on land degradation, and I love the adaptive strategies that you mentioned. So please, if anyone here has any questions to give Mr. Ibrahim, we have just 5 minutes before the meeting ends. You can ask your questions now. And we're going to also I'm going to drop some of our handles here on the chat, on the group chat. So any question that is not attended to here on the call, we will attend to it in our official handles. So if you have any question, please, the floor is open. Let's make it snappy. Is there no question? As we are waiting for, maybe others are still trying to come up with questions. Mr. Ibrahim, I have a question for you. When you were talking about land degradation and soil erosion, it caught my attention. I've always been confused about the concept. Does soil erosion causes land degradation, or does land degradation lead to soil erosion? I don't really understand which causes which. Mr. Ibrahim, are you on the call?
Hello, please, can you come again with the question? I got logged out from the conversation just due to network challenge. Please, can you come again?
Okay, I said, does soil erosion lead to land degradation, or does land degradation causes soil erosion?
Okay, thank you very much for that point. I think it's a very pretty good example that you just mentioned. When we talk about land degradation, we'll talk about soil erosion. Soil erosion is one of the determinants or one of the contributors to land degradation. When your soil is eroded, that soil loses its nutrients, that soil loses its productivity, that soil loses its complexity, and that soil loses its value. So these are some of this particular instance is what leads to land degradation. You agree with me that no sensible human being today in Nigeria, and I like the fact that you are familiar with Anambra State as a whole. You agree with me that on yearly basis, the government or the citizens are lamenting of the devastating impact of gully erosion. There is nobody that will see a gully and want to erect his home there. So this is an instance how erosion has been able to degrade our land and how it has exposed our land to numerous multifaceted challenges. that we are talking about today. So basically, when we talk about soil erosion, it's a determinant or it's a contributor to land degradation. Because when it occurs or when it happens, the land loses its productivity. You can't farm in a gully erosion. It's not possible. You can't see rich wildlife species in gully erosion. So these are determinants, these are contributors to land degradation. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much, sir. You actually clarified my confusion. I'm grateful for that. This meeting is going to end in the next few seconds. I would like to thank everyone that has participated in this meeting and the keen attention that you have paid. Honestly, I don't know about you, but I know I'm going home with new knowledge and perspective concerning land degradation and forest adaptation strategies. So I already dropped the handles on the chat earlier. So if you have any other further question that you think you need an answer to, you can drop it and the answer will be provided to you.